Chapter 1. The Day They Erased My Name. The day a sheet of glass fell 12 stories from Phoenix Tower and shattered across a Seattle sidewalk, every news station asked how a brand new building had already begun to fail. But none of them knew that months earlier, my name had been erased from the design I created, the same design they secretly gutted to save money. I am Lyra, the structural engineer they pushed aside, the woman they thought would stay silent while they butchered my work. The crack that exposed everything started long before the cameras arrived. And if you want to understand how a tower nearly collapsed before it was ever finished, you need to know the day they took my design, my credit, and almost my career. The morning the presentation was scheduled, I arrived at the office earlier than usual, the kind of early when the cleaning crew was still packing up their carts, and the smell of industrial coffee from the break room had not yet settled into the air. North River Engineering in South Lake Union always felt different before the day officially began. Quieter, calmer, as if the building itself took a deep breath before the flood of meetings and deadlines consumed it. I liked those moments. They made me feel grounded before stepping into the noise. I needed that grounding more than ever. Phoenix Tower was the largest project of my career, a 32-story mixed-use high-rise priced at $180 million. A structure that would define the skyline and, if everything went right, my professional worth. I had spent 6 months developing a new elastic core system, refining load paths, running simulations during weekends in my apartment in Capitol Hill, watching the sun rise through the blinds while test results scrolled across my screen. It was the kind of work that made me forget to eat and made me feel more alive than anything else in my life. I settled into my desk and opened the slide deck. The final checks were always the most important. I adjusted the placement of 2 diagrams, corrected a mislabeled load case, ensured that the animation of the lateral force response ran smoothly. My fingers knew the keyboard by muscle memory. A few coworkers passed by and greeted me, but I barely registered their voices. My mind was in the conference room already, rehearsing the technical points that Mark said he wanted me ready to answer. He had insisted I stand in the back and only speak if spoken to. He said it with a smile, but the smile never reached his eyes. By the time I walked toward the conference floor, the hallway was alive with chatter. Executives from the Phoenix Project Board were already taking their seats. The conference room was bright, overly air-conditioned, polished to the point of feeling staged. A long table dominated the center of the room, the kind only high-level clients ever sat around. I remained by the side wall near the equipment stand, close enough to assist, but far enough not to be noticed. Mark entered a few minutes later, wearing a tailored navy suit that looked more expensive than anything he could realistically afford. He flashed a grin at the room and gave a reassuring nod to the board members. He had charisma. I will give him that. He knew exactly how to fill a room with confidence, even when that confidence was built on someone else's foundation. When the lights dimmed and the slideshow began, I folded my hands together to stop them from shaking. I watched the first slide appear on the screen: Phoenix Tower structural concept. Underneath it, bold and centered, was Mark Halstead, lead architect. No mention of my name, not even a footnote. I felt a small pang in my chest, but told myself to wait, that maybe my credit would appear when the technical section began. Slide after slide passed. He spoke about the enhanced ductility of the core, the optimized load paths, the drift control that exceeded city code requirements. Every phrase was mine, almost word for word from my notes, and still my name did not show. By the midpoint of the presentation, my breath tightened. I could feel heat gathering behind my eyes. I looked around the room, trying to anchor myself. Julia sat near the far end of the table, her eyes flicking toward me with a brief look of concern. She must have noticed my frozen posture. A board member whispered to another about how impressive the system was. Mark nodded as if receiving a well-deserved compliment. The mini-climax struck quietly but violently. He reached the slide labeled Innovation and proudly explained how he had reimagined traditional shear wall systems by integrating an elastic core mechanism. The animation I had spent 2 nights perfecting spun on the screen. My animation, my math, my sleepless hours, presented as his stroke of brilliance. I felt the floor steady itself under my shoes, and for a second I wondered if anyone else could hear my heart pounding. I forced myself to breathe evenly, Losing composure here would only give them what they expected: a woman who could not handle pressure, a woman who should stay in the background. The presentation ended with applause. Mark shook hands, smiled broadly, and glanced briefly in my direction before turning away again. It was a look that said he had won something, a look that said I should know my place. After the room emptied, I followed him down the hall. He was already loosening his tie, humming as if the morning had been nothing more than routine. When we stepped into his office, he closed the door behind him and leaned casually against his desk. I told him that the presentation had used my design in its entirety. My voice sounded calmer than I felt. He raised his eyebrows in a show of confusion, then let out a soft laugh. He said the design belonged to the team, that leadership had decided to streamline attribution, that individual names would only distract from the collective effort. He told me to be grateful, because the exposure would benefit everyone. I told him it was wrong. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. He said I needed to be careful. He said pushing this issue would make me seem difficult, that it would not be good for my career or my reputation. His tone was gentle, but the warning beneath it was sharp and unmistakable. Then he smiled again and opened the office door, as if dismissing a child after a tantrum. An hour later, HR called me in. They used neutral tones and polite smiles, the kind that hid sharpened edges. They reminded me that all work produced at North River was the intellectual property of the company. They reiterated that disputes over authorship disrupted workflow and could be seen as insubordination. They suggested I take a long weekend and return on Monday with a fresh perspective. I left their office feeling as if the walls had leaned in to swallow my voice whole. I walked toward the parking level, unable to shake the hollow ache in my stomach. My footsteps echoed against the concrete. When I reached my car, a figure stepped out from behind a support pillar, Julia. She looked around to make sure no one else was near. She held a small USB drive in her hand, and her voice dropped to a whisper. She told me to take it. She said I needed to see what was on it, and that if she handed it to me on company property, she risked being fired. Her eyes were wide with something between fear and loyalty. She pressed the drive into my palm and told me to go straight home. Then she turned and walked away without another word. I sat in my car with the USB resting in my hand, feeling its weight as if it were something alive. For a moment, I simply stared at it. A small piece of plastic and metal capable of either saving me or destroying both of us. That evening, I sat at my kitchen island in Capitol Hill, with only the hum of the refrigerator breaking the silence. I plugged in the USB and opened the first file. It was a system log tracing the history of the Phoenix Tower structural model. My name appeared as the original creator, dated December 23rd of the previous year. Then the edits began, one by one, all signed under Mark's credentials, and two senior architects who rarely touched structural files. Each edit trimmed away safety margins, reduced reinforcement, altered load assumptions. Each edit made the design cheaper and more dangerous. I scrolled through line after line, feeling a cold heaviness settle in my chest. This was not simply stealing credit. This was altering my work in ways that put lives at risk. He had not only taken my design, he had butchered it. When I reached the final log entry, my hands trembled. I closed the laptop and stood up, needing air. Rain streaked the window in steady sheets. Seattle rain always felt familiar to me, but tonight it felt different. Like the city itself understood something had shifted. I pressed my palm against the glass and watched the blurred lights of the street below. The cars moved slowly through the wet pavement, and the sound of sirens echoed faintly in the distance. I thought about the years I had spent building my career, the long nights, the quiet pride I carried in my work. I thought about how easily my name had been erased. For most of my life, I had chosen silence because silence felt safer. But that night, staring out into the rain, I knew silence would not protect me anymore. I had stepped into something larger than I had ever faced. And whether I wanted to or not, I had already begun a path I could not turn away from. If this story touched you, please subscribe and let someone out there feel less alone. Thank you. Chapter 2. The First Cracks. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual with the same heaviness still sitting in my chest. The rain had stopped sometime before dawn, and Seattle looked washed clean through my kitchen window, but nothing inside me felt clean or quiet. I sat at the counter with my laptop open and stared at the blank email screen for a long time before typing a request for a technical authorship review. I wrote it carefully, every sentence measured, every word chosen to sound professional rather than emotional. When I pressed send, a strange calm settled over me, like the click of the mouse had cut a thin thread. By noon, there was no reply. By the end of the day, there was still silence. HR stayed quiet. Leadership stayed quiet. The only message I received was a private one from an associate director who rarely spoke to me. He wrote that stirring up past work attribution would not help my future progress and suggested that I focus on the upcoming phases instead of digging into old ground. I read his message twice before closing my phone. It felt less like advice and more like a warning dressed in politeness. Later that evening, Julia asked if we could talk outside the building. We walked along the sidewalk near the parking structure, our steps echoing off the concrete. She looked tense, her hands tucked deep into her jacket pockets. She told me she had once been forced by Mark to sign off on a mistake he had made during a retrofit project back in 2022. He had framed it as a team decision and convinced leadership that she had overlooked something crucial. She said she carried the blame for months until the project ended. I could see tears forming, but she blinked them away and said she refused to let the same thing happen to me. My chest tightened hearing that it made everything feel heavier and more real. That night at home, I booted up my laptop and used the temporary admin access Julia had slipped to me. The screen filled with layers of structural drawings and folders containing revision histories. The December 2023 model opened beautifully. It was exactly as I designed it: strong, balanced, safe. Then I opened the March 2024 version. Immediately, I saw the differences. Reinforcement bars reduced by nearly 40%. Load assumptions altered to mimic lighter stress scenarios. Several safety margins cut in ways that made the system look stable on paper, but dangerously fragile in reality. It felt like someone had used a knife on something I had built with my own hands. My stomach twisted as I scrolled through edit logs. I recognized the initials of Mark and the two senior architects. I closed the file and pushed my chair back, unable to sit still. The next morning, I walked into Mark's office without knocking. He was leaning back in his chair sipping coffee, looking relaxed, as if the world outside his window existed solely to admire him. I told him what I found, keeping my voice steady. He listened with an amused expression, then set his cup down and leaned back farther. He told me that I lacked financial perspective, that I saw only the engineering side, and refused to acknowledge the reality of budget constraints. He said Phoenix Tower would never get built at my cost levels, and that his adjustments were necessary for the survival of the project. When I told him that safety could not be compromised, he smiled, a slow, infuriating smile that made my skin crawl. He said that decisions like these were for people who understood the industry and that I should let the grown-ups handle it. The words hit like a slap. I stood there stunned for a moment before turning and walking out. My hands were shaking by the time I reached the hallway. I spent lunch sitting in the courtyard alone, the sunlight cold on my shoulders despite the clear day. Every instinct in me screamed that I needed help from someone who understood corporate manipulation better than I did. That afternoon, I searched for whistleblower attorneys in Seattle and found the name Vivian Cross. Her case record was intimidating. She had represented engineers, analysts, medical researchers, people who had been pushed aside or punished for speaking up. I booked a consultation and drove across town to her office in Belltown. Vivian was older, calm, and unnervingly perceptive. After listening to my story, she asked to see the USB. She plugged it into her computer and scanned the contents without saying a word, her face unreadable. When she finally looked up, she told me in a firm and steady tone that I was not wrong, that the edits were suspicious in both timing and intent, and that the safety implications were serious. She said I needed to follow a specific legal path if I wanted to survive what might come next. She warned me that people like Mark rarely backed down, and that the company would likely try to isolate me. I felt something between fear and relief settle in me. At least someone believed me. By the next morning, her prediction became real. I arrived at the office to find an unexpected email waiting in my inbox. It informed me that I was being reassigned to the Tacoma satellite office, effective immediately. The message stated that project staffing was being rebalanced and that my presence at the Seattle headquarters was no longer necessary. My badge access to the Phoenix Tower archives had already been revoked. I read the email 3 times before the truth fully hit. They were cutting me out. They were removing me from every piece of evidence. As I sat there processing the message, my phone buzzed. It was Sam Torres. He was much younger than me, 28, but smarter and more diligent than most people twice his age. His text said that the materials arriving on site were lower grade than the specifications shown in the filed drawings. He wrote that he thought I should know. I called him immediately. His voice was low and shaky, like he was speaking from a corner where no one could hear him. He said that the concrete mix looked cheaper, the rebar bundles lighter, and that the foreman had been instructed to move quickly through inspections. He said he did not know who to trust on site and that he feared speaking up directly. I thanked him and told him to stay careful. When we hung up, I felt a cold line crawl down my spine. This was bigger than I expected. That evening, Sam called again. He said something had changed at the site. Phoenix Development Group had complained about delays and ordered an early lateral load test to be conducted within the week. That test was supposed to happen much later in the process. Rushing, it was unusual, dangerous even. He whispered that the site manager told the crew to expect observers from both the city and the investor side. Something about the tone of his voice told me he was terrified. After the call ended, I drove to Queen Anne, where Phoenix Tower rose above the surrounding buildings like a skeletal giant. The sky was a muted blue-gray, fading into dusk, and the steel frame of the tower glowed faintly from the last light of day. Construction cranes hung motionless, their arms stretching against the sky. I parked and stood near the safety barrier, watching workers secure equipment for the night. The tower had reached its 12th floor. The floors above were outlines waiting to be built, hollow silhouettes against the evening light. As I watched the wind move through the exposed beams, I felt that strange intuition again, the same cold warning I had felt the first night I opened the USB. Something inside that structure was wrong. Not just on paper, not just in the logs. Something inside the tower itself was waiting to reveal the truth. The sound of a truck backing up echoed across the street, sharp against the quiet air. A group of workers laughed as they left through the gate. I stayed where I was, staring up at the enormous frame. A chill ran across my arms, even beneath my jacket. The tower seemed to lean slightly when the wind pushed, although I knew it was only an illusion created by the angles of the steel. Still, I could not shake the feeling. Only one thought repeated in my mind as I watched Phoenix Tower rise into the darkening sky. It would take only one strong shake for everything they had tried to bury to break open. If this story touched you, please subscribe, and let someone out there feel less alone. Thank you. Chapter 3. The Shake That Spoke the Truth. The morning of the inspection arrived colder than the forecast had promised. A thin mist clung to the streets around Queen Anne and drifted between the construction cranes like something unsettled. I parked several blocks away and walked toward the site with my hands buried deep in my coat pockets, my heart thudding in a way that made each step feel heavier than the last. The sidewalk was lined with vans from local news stations, their antennas raised and cameras already pointed toward the temporary stage set up near the entrance. Phoenix Tower had never attracted this much attention before. It made my stomach twist. From behind the barriers, I spotted Mark shaking hands with a reporter. He had chosen a charcoal suit and a smile that could have been cut from glossy advertising. He looked like the face of a visionary project. To the people watching, he probably was. He spoke animatedly, hands gesturing toward the tower as if he had poured his soul into every beam and bolt. Sam appeared beside the gate and lifted the corner of the caution tape just enough for me to duck under. His voice was low as he leaned toward me. "He asked where you were," Sam said. "I told him you weren't on the list." He looked relieved. I figured, I whispered back. Thank you for getting me in. Stay close to me. They won't question it if you look like staff. We slipped inside and moved toward a raised observation deck reserved for contractors and the inspection team. I tried to stay behind Sam, keeping my head down, but I could not resist glancing toward Mark. His confidence radiated across the site. Cameras followed him as he explained the brilliance of Phoenix Tower and the groundbreaking approach to lateral load control. I wondered if he practiced those lines in a mirror. When the inspectors arrived, the energy shifted. Elliot Burns walked with the quiet authority of someone who had been through enough disasters to understand the weight of his job. He was in his mid-40s, tall, with a sharp jaw and a calm, steady walk. There was something intimidating about the way he scanned the tower, as if he were memorizing every bolt and joint. Sam leaned slightly toward me and whispered, "That's Elliot. Worked on post-quake evaluations in California for years. People say he can spot a flaw from across a street." "He looks like it," I murmured back. Elliot addressed the group without raising his voice. "We will begin the controlled lateral load test at 50% intensity. All non-essential personnel should remain behind designated lines. Cameras stay behind the media barrier. No exceptions." The crew scrambled into position. Technicians activated the machinery that would simulate the lateral forces. I stepped closer to the railing, my fingers gripping the metal bar harder than I intended. The steel frame of Phoenix Tower loomed above us, floor 12 marked with a bright orange flag. My chest tightened as I stared at that level. That was where the reinforcement had been cut. That was where everything fragile hid behind layers of concrete. The machinery roared to life. The ground vibrated beneath my boots as the simulation began. Phoenix Tower swayed gently at first, like a giant inhaling cameras clicked. Reporters murmured. Mark stood near the front, arms crossed, posture proud. He looked like a man waiting to receive applause. Sam watched the readings on a tablet. 50%, he said. I swallowed hard. The tower flexed again. Everything looked stable, but I knew what numbers lay behind the surface. Elliot signaled to ramp up the intensity. The machinery groaned, and the vibration deepened. A hush fell over the crowd. 70%, Sam said quietly. I held my breath. My eyes locked on the 12th floor. For a moment, nothing happened. Then I saw it. A faint line appeared across the concrete, almost invisible at first. It spread like a thin crack in ice. My breath caught in my throat. "Sam," I whispered. "Look." He followed my gaze. His eyes widened. The crack lengthened in one swift movement, stretching across nearly a meter of the wall. A second later, the alarm blared. Sharp and shrill, people shouted. Workers scattered from the lower floors. The tower swayed slightly, then steadied. Chaos erupted around us. A reporter yelled something about structural failure. Mark spun toward the site manager and demanded to know why the concrete mix was inconsistent. His voice rose sharply. "This is on Mason and Co. They used the wrong materials. I told them to adhere to spec." Sam muttered under his breath. "He is lying." I felt heat rise in my chest. I stepped forward, my footsteps heavy on the deck. Elliot turned just as I approached him. His eyes narrowed slightly as if recognizing me from somewhere. "I need to speak with you," I said. My voice surprised even me. It was firmer than I felt. He studied me for a moment. "You are not listed as project staff for today." "She designed the original core system," Sam blurted out. Elliot raised an eyebrow. "Is that true?" I nodded. My hands trembled, but I held them steady. "I have the original drawings and the full edit log. This crack is from altered reinforcement. The March revision removed critical material." He held out his hand. "Show me." My phone felt slippery in my grip as I opened the email Julia had sent that morning. She had encrypted it heavily. It took a few seconds to load. When the file opened, I handed the screen to Elliot. He scrolled through the entries, his expression shifting almost imperceptibly. His jaw tightened. "Where did you get this access?" he asked. "From an authorized user." "Who authorized it?" Silence. I could not risk naming Julia. "I cannot disclose that," I said quietly. "But the data is accurate." He continued reading. The more he saw, the colder his face became. Then he turned to Mark. Mr. Halstead, I need your company-issued laptop and tablet for verification. Mark laughed, but it was brittle. You cannot request private property without going through North River Management. This is not a request. This is a safety investigation. Your device history is relevant to the structural modifications recorded here. You cannot just accuse me based on an unverified log from an unauthorized source. This is ridiculous. His voice grew louder with each word. The cameras began drifting closer. A few reporters sensed tension. Mark stepped forward as if to block Elliot's view of the tower behind him. Hand over the device, Elliot said, his tone flat, unmovable. I will not. You can talk to my director before touching anything. Elliot turned to the inspection crew. Document his refusal. Continue sealing the 12th floor access point. This site is under review. Mark's face reddened. He muttered angrily to someone on his team and stormed away. The cameras followed him. Catching every stiff movement, I stood still, heart pounding, unsure if what I had done would help or destroy me. Sam touched my shoulder lightly. You did the right thing. It does not feel like it yet. It will. The test was called off, and the site was partially evacuated. I left before anyone could question me further. I walked several blocks away before my knees felt steady enough to drive. By the time I reached my apartment, the afternoon sun had already faded behind thick clouds. My phone buzzed with notifications, but I ignored them and collapsed onto the couch. 2 hours later, the world shifted for a second time. A small tremor rippled through Seattle just after sunset. It was barely a quake, but enough to rattle windows and startle people out of their routines. I felt the vibration under my feet and froze. Then my phone lit up with alerts. Sam's messages flooded in. Glass fell from Phoenix Tower. South-facing panel shattered. People filmed it. It is everywhere. I rushed to turn on the news. A shaky video taken by a passerby filled the screen. The tower shuddered when the tremor hit. A large pane from one of the upper floors broke free and crashed onto the sidewalk. Cars screeched to a stop. Someone screamed in the background. The footage looped again and again. The anchor spoke with urgency about unsafe construction practices and potential negligence. Phoenix Tower flashed across the chyron alongside words like emergency and violation and investigation. I sat on the floor, knees pulled to my chest, watching the images repeat. My hands were cold. My breath came shallow. I had feared this. I had warned them, and now the city was watching. When the segment ended, I muted the television and let the silence settle. Outside my window, the lights of Seattle flickered against the darkness. Steady and indifferent, I realized then that the truth no longer needed my voice to be heard. It was already rising through the cracks they had tried to seal. If this story touched you, please subscribe and let someone out there feel less alone. Thank you. Chapter 4. The Truth Breaks Open. The morning after the glass fell from Phoenix Tower, I woke to a dozen alerts buzzing against my nightstand. I reached for my phone, with a heaviness still lingering in my chest from the night before. Every notification was the same type: breaking news, emergency review, structural failure at downtown construction site. I pushed myself upright and turned on the television. Reporters stood behind police tape with Phoenix Tower rising in the background like a wounded giant. The south-facing side of the building glinted irregularly where the glass had shattered. The headlines scrolled beneath them with an intensity that made my pulse quicken. I sat perfectly still and watched the coverage shift from one angle to another. Drone footage of the 12th floor, interviews with shaken pedestrians, rumors about internal negligence. The story had already spread far beyond Seattle. By the time I finished my coffee, my inbox was full of messages from coworkers, most of them frantic or vague. Then my phone rang. It was Sam. His voice cracked with adrenaline. Lyra, they locked down the whole site. Phoenix Development came in before sunrise. Nobody is allowed past the perimeter. Are you all right? I asked. Yes. They questioned everyone who was on duty last night. They shut down deliveries, and they called for a full independent audit. He paused, then added quietly, You started something they can't bury. A A small shiver spread across my back. I thanked him and told him to stay safe. The call barely ended before my email pinged again. This time it was an official notice from Phoenix Development Group. They announced an immediate suspension of construction activities and the hiring of an independent engineering firm to perform a full structural review. The message was firm and cold. They were not going to protect North River this time. Within an hour, the company sent its own internal email. It was full of polished phrases, temporary setbacks, unexpected incident, cooperation with authorities. But buried in the last paragraph was what I expected. An emergency meeting with the Phoenix Project Board had been scheduled. I was not invited. I drove to the office anyway. North River felt different the moment I stepped inside. People whispered in hallways. Desks were empty. Several offices had doors closed with paper signs taped over the nameplates. I passed two senior architects, both avoiding eye contact. When I reached the main conference area, the glass walls were covered with privacy screens. I could see silhouettes through the frosted film. I recognized Mark's stance instantly, shoulders pulled back as if he still believed he could control the narrative. A few minutes later, the conference room door opened and a handful of executives stepped out. Their faces were pale and strained. I caught a fragment of conversation as they passed. Blame the contractor first. Reinforce that. We need everything pointing outward. It will not hold if the audit finds the internal revisions. Then fix the record. Adjust the documentation. Move all authorship under Halstead. He takes the design lead publicly. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. They were rewriting history before the audit even began. I stepped back before anyone noticed me and moved toward a quieter hallway. That was when my phone buzzed again. It was a message from Julia, 4 words. I have been suspended. I called her immediately. She answered on the second ring, her voice tight and trembling. They said I violated confidentiality. They escorted me out of the building this morning. I am not allowed to access the system. I think Mark told them I leaked files. I leaned against the wall, closing my eyes. Julia, I am so sorry. Do not apologize, she said, her voice cracking. If you win this, you save me. If you do not, then none of this matters anyway. They already destroyed my position. There was a long pause. Then she whispered, Do not let them twist the truth, Lyra. You are the only one who can prove what really happened. The call ended, and I felt my throat tighten. I walked outside into the cold morning air, letting the sting of it bring me back to myself. For a long moment, I simply stood there looking at the downtown skyline. The tower that should have been my triumph was now my ruin and my witness. The audit team arrived within 24 hours. They set up a temporary office in a building adjacent to Phoenix Tower and requested every version of the structural model. They also demanded access to the logs, the revision history, the emails, the internal memos. People rushed around trying to gather everything while speaking in clipped, nervous tones. I stayed out of the way, but I watched. I watched every face and every whisper. 2 days later, the independent engineers submitted a preliminary report to Phoenix Development. I received a copy from Vivian. I sat at my kitchen counter again and opened the file with trembling fingers. The mini-climax hit me like a physical force. The report stated clearly that the original design met all required safety standards. It described my model with precision and even complemented the load distribution method I had created. Then it contrasted that with the March revision, noting significant reductions in reinforcement and unsafe adjustments to the load paths. The language was clinical, but the meaning was devastating. The revision had destabilized the building. The revision had caused the crack. I exhaled slowly and closed the file. A kind of quiet victory flickered to life inside me, but it was weighed down by fear for what would happen next. Later that evening, I walked to my car in the parking structure. The air was stale and cold. My footsteps echoed across the concrete. I pressed the unlock button on my key fob. The headlights blinked. I opened the door and sat down, letting myself breathe in the familiar smell of worn leather. Just as I reached for the ignition, someone knocked on the window. I jumped. When I turned, I saw Mark standing outside the car, hands in his pockets, expression irritatingly calm. I rolled the window down an inch. "What do you want?" He leaned closer and said in a smooth voice, "We need to talk. I have nothing to say to you." He glanced around the empty parking level as if making sure no one was nearby. "Look, Lyra, things are bad, but they do not have to get worse. If you stand next to me as a co-author on the design, we can end this quietly. I will take the heat for the materials issue. You get credit. Everything moves forward." I stared at him in disbelief. "You want me to lie?" "I want you to survive. This industry is brutal. You cannot keep making enemies." His voice lowered even more. "Do not be naive. You do not know how this world works." A slow, hot anger rose through me. "I know exactly how it works. That is the problem." His jaw tightened. "You are making a mistake." "No," I said. "I am correcting one." He stepped back from the car, eyes narrowing with sharp hostility. Then he turned and walked toward the elevators without another word. I drove home with my hands clenched around the steering wheel. The following day, the real twist hit the city like a spark to dry grass. Mason and Coworkers, the contracting firm, held a small press briefing outside their office. A crowd gathered, reporters pushing close. I watched the live stream from my desk. The spokesperson adjusted his glasses and spoke plainly. North River Engineering, specifically senior architect Mark Halstead, instructed us to reduce reinforcement quantities by approximately 40% in the first quarter of 2024. He insisted the changes were approved internally. We expressed concern but were told the specifications were revised for cost efficiency and performance would not be compromised. The room erupted in shouts. Mark's name appeared in headlines within minutes. Every news station ran the story. The shift was immediate. Public sentiment swung sharply, and suddenly people began asking why the original designer was removed from the project. My name came up in several comment threads. I closed my laptop and sat very still. An hour later, I received an email from Phoenix Development asking me to appear as a participant in the formal hearing regarding the structural failure they referred to me as the original engineer of the core system. They requested my cooperation and documentation. Attached was a date and time. Vivian called that evening. "We expected this," she said. "The investigation committee needs your testimony. I will prepare you. Bring everything you have." She spoke calmly, but I felt the weight of it pressing against my ribs. I gathered all my notes, the USB, printed logs, old drafts, everything that told the story of what I had built and what had been done to it. That night, I sat at my desk reviewing every file one last time. I felt something shift inside me, something steadier than fear. I opened my laptop, pulled up the hearing invitation, and clicked the confirmation button. The message sent. A small icon blinked. My reflection stared back at me from the dark screen, tired but certain. I leaned back in my chair and let the quiet settle around me. The next chapter of this fight was already in motion, and for the first time I was no longer running behind the truth, I was walking beside it. If this story touched you, please subscribe and let someone out there feel less alone. Thank you. Chapter 5. The Fall and the Rise. The morning of the hearing arrived with a deep quiet that felt heavier than the gray clouds hanging over Seattle. I dressed carefully, choosing a simple dark suit that made me feel grounded. As I drove toward the Phoenix Development headquarters overlooking Elliott Bay, the city looked muted, as if holding its breath along with me. The lobby was full of people moving briskly, security badges clipped to jackets, voices low and tense. A receptionist guided me to the top floor, where the conference room waited behind a pair of glass doors. Inside, the atmosphere felt cold and controlled. The long table was arranged with nameplates and microphones. At the far end sat the Phoenix Development Review Committee, their expressions stern and unreadable. On one side of the room were representatives from North River Engineering, all wearing the strained look of people who feared what the next hours would reveal. Mark sat among them, shoulders rigid and gaze fixed ahead, pretending I did not exist. Vivian stood near my chair and gave me a small nod as I sat down. Her presence steadied me. When the session began, The lead investigator asked me to recount everything from the beginning. I rested my hands on the table and tried to slow my breathing. My voice came out steady. I explained the December 2023 structural model. I detailed the reinforced elastic core system, the load paths, the testing simulations I described, the changes I discovered in the March revision, the cuts to the reinforcement, the shifts in lateral load assumptions. I explained the email from HR that dismissed my concerns, the manipulation from leadership, the moments in the conference room when my authorship was erased. I spoke about the lateral load test, the crack, the alarm, the chaos that followed. I spoke about the small quake that rattled Seattle and the glass that fell onto the street below. For a long moment after I finished, the room was silent. Then the committee directed their attention to Elliot Burns. He stood and adjusted his jacket before speaking. His voice held no hesitation. He stated that his team had reviewed every version of the structural model. He confirmed that my original design met every safety requirement and exceeded several of them. He confirmed that the March revision was the only version containing dangerous reductions. He also confirmed that those reductions aligned with the exact location of the structural failure during the test and the glass impact after the quake. Every face on the North River side shifted with quiet panic. Someone cleared his throat. Another reached for a pen and dropped it. Mark finally lifted his head slightly, his jaw tight. The committee asked him to speak. He attempted a calm tone, but it cracked at the edges. He insisted there had been a misunderstanding. He claimed that the revisions were misinterpreted or entered incorrectly by someone on the team. He tried to hint that Mason and company had deviated from the specifications and that the fault lay with the contractor, but every word he said bounced weakly against the evidence. The committee showed him the contractor's press briefing. They showed him the logs from the internal system. They showed him the audit results. His face lost its confidence. He looked smaller somehow, as if the weight of the truth pressed down on him until the polished exterior shattered. The final decision came swiftly. Phoenix Development terminated Mark on the spot. He was asked to surrender his badge and escorted out by security. Not a single person on the North River side tried to defend him. The company was ordered to halt all construction activity immediately and would be placed under direct oversight for the remaining phases. The tower core had to be redesigned from the beginning. Leadership at North River was told to restructure or face further investigation. Every person in that room understood the magnitude of what had happened. When the committee recessed, Vivienne touched my arm. "You handled yourself well," she said softly. "I only told the truth," I whispered. As the room emptied, one of the Phoenix Development executives approached me. He introduced himself and thanked me for my integrity. He told me they wanted someone they could trust to lead the reconstruction of Phoenix Tower. Then he looked directly into my eyes and asked if I would accept the position of lead structural engineer for Phoenix Tower. 2.0. I felt the air leave my lungs in a slow, measured exhale. I told him yes. Before leaving the building, I asked to speak to the board about Julia. I explained what had happened to her and how she had risked her career to protect the accuracy of the project. They listened carefully and agreed that she would be reinstated with full protection under whistleblower policies. I texted her the news as soon as I reached the lobby. Her reply came quickly. "Thank you. You saved me." A warmth spread through my chest that had nothing to do with victory and everything to do with the relief of pulling someone else out from under the crushing weight of injustice. 2 days later, I returned to the site to begin consultations with the new oversight team. The air felt different. Workers nodded at me as I passed. Some smiled. Sam met me near the entrance and walked beside me toward the temporary command trailer. "The crew knows what you did," he said. "I did what anyone would have done," I replied. He shook his head lightly. "No. A lot of people would have looked away. They are calling you the one who did not give up, even when they tried to shut you out." I felt a flutter of emotion I was not prepared for. Gratitude mixed with something deeper, something like belonging. For the first time since this ordeal began, I felt seen without being claimed, heard without being silenced. Later that evening, after reviewing the initial reconstruction sketches, I checked my email. A message from Chicago waited at the top of my inbox. A major engineering firm offered me the position of technical director. The salary was generous and the title impressive. I read the offer twice, then looked out my living room window at the glowing lights of Seattle reflecting against Elliott Bay. I thought about everything this city had taken from me and everything it had forced me to become. I closed the email and typed a short, polite decline. My place was here. I needed to rebuild what had been broken, not walk away from it. Spring arrived slowly, softening the edges of the cold. On the first clear morning of March 2025, I visited the Phoenix Tower site again. The redesigned steel frame rose clean and sharp into the sky. The beams gleamed under the early sun. The core was stronger now, anchored by the principles I had fought for. Wind moved gently through the structure, whispering through open floors that would soon become something solid and real. I stood near the base, hands tucked into my pockets, feeling the ground steady beneath my feet. For months, I had been forced into the shadows, erased, dismissed, corrected, doubted. Now the tower stood in front of me, built on a foundation no one could take credit for but the truth itself. No one would be able to erase my name again. Not from this project. Not from my work. Not from myself. Revenge does not need to be loud. Sometimes it is as simple as standing firmly in the light until the truth becomes too large for anyone to hide. If you have ever been silenced or pushed aside, let this be a reminder that your voice matters more than you know. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stay with me. Your presence here keeps these stories alive.